Will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We will begin this subcommittee hearing with the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley, leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. The flag there and there. Thank you. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the exploitation of children in the United States and abroad. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I am grateful that all of you are here today, both the witnesses, the members of the committee, and then also the audience. We appreciate you being here. I wish we didn't have to hold a hearing on this topic because that would mean children in our country and abroad are safe from exploitation. Unfortunately, that is not the case. It is a fact that our children are not safe online, and it is utterly unacceptable. Predators use the internet to trick and exploit innocent children. Children are trafficked through social media apps. This is the worst type of evil. To our strong survivor leaders in the room and watching from afar, we see you, we hear you, your voice matters, and we appreciate you, and we want to be supportive. Reports of CSAM continue to grow exponentially, from 3,000 reports in 1998 to more than 1 million in 2014 and 18.4 million in 2019 and more than 30 million last year. We cannot stand by and let this number grow continually. While it seems like CSAM is something that happens in foreign countries or in even different neighborhoods from our own, it is much closer than anyone would think. This is a homegrown issue. We know that offenders prey on the most vulnerable populations, such as children in foster care. Groomers use techniques to normalize inappropriate conduct and encourage secrecy, especially using social media platforms. There's no question these criminals must be prosecuted. While there are many solutions to combating this issue, we must assure prosecutors are doing their jobs to put these criminals behind bars. We cannot accept lenient sentences or sweetheart plea deals for those who wish to bring harm to innocent children. Today, between school and home, children have unfettered access to technology, and big tech is taking that opportunity to choose profits over people, over our children. Targeted algorithms connect consumers to information and content, including CSAM content, traffickers, predators, and drug dealers. It is well documented that traffickers and pedophiles use social media to target children and to share and engage with CSAM content. The Wall Street Journal, along with top researchers across the country, ran a detailed account of Instagram's, quote, vast pedophile network, close quote. The research found that Instagram enabled people to search explicit hashtags and connect users to accounts to advertise CSAM. One researcher gravely noted, quote, Instagram is an on-ramp to places on the internet where there's more explicit child sexual abuse. Close quote. You would think social media companies would bend over backwards to work with law enforcement and to remove this content from their platform and prevent it from happening at all. But that is not the case. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok all allow the proliferation of abuse images and human trafficking on its platforms. Images are allowed to roam on the internet. Humans are bought and sold. Apple even threatened to remove both Facebook and Instagram's access to the App Store because the problem was so bad. And yet big tech continues to allow these problems to occur. Targeted algorithms seem to be more profitable than investing in protecting children. Big tech seems to have no problem censoring speech or other things they consider disinformation, yet they allow these predators to access children on the internet and allow images to remain on the internet for years. That is unacceptable. Big tech must be held accountable, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how that can occur. We know trafficking is an issue that occurs within the United States and abroad. Many of us have heard and seen the movie Sound of Freedom and how it opened our eyes to the horror that is occurring both in and outside our country. However, many do not know Hollywood attempted to shut the film down, not wanting the American people to see the film and learn about these terrible crimes. Yet the film became one of the most successful independent films in history. It has grossed $191 million and counting. Sound of Freedom truly exposed the worst of humanity and showed us how we can all play a part to keep children safe. Our committee is collaborating with Homeland Security investigations to enhance our knowledge and understanding of investigations related to human trafficking and child exploitation. I express my gratitude to the special agents of HSI for their unwavering commitment to safeguarding children and liberating victims from the atrocities of human trafficking. Many children, especially those crossing the border as unaccompanied minors, are not safe. Lax border policies promoted by the Biden administration are leading to vulnerable children being exploited by cartels and smugglers as they attempt to come to America. The journey today for them is incredibly dangerous, and their risk of being sex trafficked is incredibly high while being smuggled across our border. In fact, the United Nations this week alone said the most dangerous migration route is Mexico to the United States. In 2014, then President Obama stated, quote, "Don't send your children unaccompanied. They might not make it," close quote. But I have heard nothing like that from this administration. We need to be louder, stronger, and bolder. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can enforce the law, hold big tech accountable, and protect our children from the horrific crime of sex trafficking, because children are not for sale. This topic is tough and unfortunately an unnecessary topic. I hope that we each can learn together. I think there'll be broad aspects of support across this entire committee, both sides of the aisle, and I look forward to working together with my colleagues across the aisle. And with that, I thank you again for being here, and I yield back. Unfortunately, today, Ms. Jackson Lee, the ranking member, is unable to join us for health reasons. In her stead, I will recognize Ms. Dean for an opening statement.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Biggs, thank you for convening this important hearing today, and I thank all of you for being here, both those in the audience and those who have come to testify before us. It is an important hearing to discuss the deeply disturbing and pervasive issue that is plaguing our country and our world, child exploitation. I'm standing in for Ranking Member Sheila Jackson Lee, who regrettably cannot be with us today, and I'm honored to be in her stead. I know that this subject is deeply personal to her, as it is to me, because although the United States is a nation known for its foundational ideals of liberty and protection of its citizens, we continue to struggle with the existence and prevalence of child exploitation. It takes on various forms, ranging from child labor and sex trafficking to the production and distribution of child sexual abuse materials, online harassment, and sextortion. Perpetrators of these repulsive crimes hide within our society, preying upon innocent and defenseless young people, their victims, who should be experiencing the joys of their formative years. I take this particularly personal as a mother and as a grandmother of 4. Last Congress, Ranking Member Jackson Lee convened a hearing on the federal response to human trafficking that provided a wealth of information that I was able to apply in my own efforts to tackle the scourge of trafficking. Child labor trafficking, a sad reality in many industries around the globe and even in the United States, harms children's health, often deprives them of an education, denies them a normal childhood, and deprives them of their basic human rights. Another ghastly aspect of child exploitation is child sex trafficking, where children are lured away from the safety of their homes, their loved ones, their schools, their communities, stripped of their humanity and exploited for various nefarious purposes. Roughly 25% of all human trafficking victims are children worldwide, and most of them being sex trafficked. At this very moment, there are children as young as 11 years old in the United States and abroad who are forced to commit commercial sex acts and other unspeakable acts. Let me be clear, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. These young victims who have been exploited, abused, trafficked, whether for sex or labor, deserve victim-focused, culturally informed responses that direct them away from the criminal justice system and towards services and programming critical to the restoration of their health and their dignity. Some people would have us believe the trafficking of minors is primarily an immigration problem, a result of poor control at our borders, or a problem of urban impoverished children and youth. But the reality is that the traffickers prey on stigmatized, forgotten, vulnerable American children and youth. In suburban, rural, urban, in cities in every corner of this country, only valuing them as commodities and not as the precious people that they are. While any child can become a victim of sex or labor trafficking, some children and youth are more vulnerable than others. If we truly want to extend and end the trafficking of children and youth, or child exploitation of any kind, we will make certain that all children and youth are located, treated as victims, not criminals, and connected to the services and programs they need. In this digital age of smartphones and handhelds, social media, direct messages, and TikTok, predators can victimize children and youth without having to move from one location to another. Online child exploitation has reached epidemic status globally. These individuals exploit children throughout the United States from anywhere in the world, and their criminal activity is often cloaked behind encryption. They also hide behind cute screen names, catchy hashtags, fake profiles, with the goal of eventually coercing, manipulating, or even blackmailing their young victims. Because child predators tend to prey upon children even when they're in school, Ranking Member Sheila Jackson Lee introduced H.R. 30, the Stop Human Trafficking in School Zones Act, that would establish an enhanced penalty for child exploitation offenses that are committed within school zones or near school activities or other child-centered locations. This would apply to those individuals who dare contact children while they are attempting to gain an education or participating in school-related activities. Child sexual abuse material inflicts untold emotional damage on victims, especially, as you point out, Mr. Chairman, since the internet enables their repeated victimization each time images of their suffering are viewed. Recognizing the breadth and scope of this issue, it is our collective responsibility as representatives, all of us, to protect all of our children and eradicate every form of child exploitation. That's why I hope today's discussion will be not about blame, speculation, fear-mongering, but about ideas and solutions. I have a few of my own. First, we must adapt and strengthen our legal framework that exists to ensure children and youth are protected, that perpetrators and facilitators of any matter of child exploitation are exposed and face severe consequences. That's why I introduced H.R. 3686, Stopping Harmful Image Exploitation and Limiting Distribution Act, the SHIELD Act. This is bipartisan legislation, and it will create new penalties. I'm also the original co-sponsor of H.R. 5082, the Revising Existing Procedures on Reporting via Technology Act, more we can talk about. And secondly, we must also continue to support organizations that work tirelessly to identify, rescue, restore young victims, providing them with culturally specific care, counseling, and support that they need to heal. These organizations, like the ones represented here today, do life-saving work. And lastly, we must continue to provide public education and awareness, both of which play a pivotal role in preventing child exploitation. Child exploitation is an unconscionable reality that we must directly confront on a bipartisan basis. Every child deserves to be free from exploitation. I thank you, the witnesses who are here today. I thank you in the audience for your kind consideration of what we are talking about and your life experience. Today's conversations will lead to solutions. And as I'm yielding back, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to render into the testimony of survivors from advisory board members of PACT into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And that's also, for the record, I want to include a document, a letter to myself and Ranking Member Lee from Ending Online Exploitation of Abuse and Abuse of Children Coalition. Without objection. Thank you. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witnesses. We have a very distinguished panel with tremendous insight and experience and wisdom on this subject, and we appreciate all of you being here. Mr. John Pizzuro is the Chief Executive Officer of Raven, a nonprofit organization focused on preventing child exploitation. He previously served with the New Jersey State Police, including as the commander of the New Jersey Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. welcome. We welcome Ms. Vanessa Bautista. Ms. Bautista is a founding member of the Leadership Council for the Global Survivor Network and is a survivor of sexual abuse. The Global Survivor Network works with survivors of various forms of abuse and exploitation and advocates before local and national governments. Thank you for being here. Ms. Lorie Cohen. Ms. Cohen is the Chief Executive Officer of Protect All Children from Trafficking, or PACT. PACT works to protect children from sexual exploitation and trafficking through education, legislative advocacy, and partnerships. Thank you, Ms. Cohen, for being here. Mr. Jose Alfaro. Mr. Alfaro serves on the Board of Directors of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. He is a public speaker, author, advocate, and a survivor of child sex trafficking. The Human Trafficking Legal Center connects trafficking survivors with pro bono legal representation and advocates on their behalf. Mr. Alfaro, thank you for being here. Mr. John Tonago, how is that? Where am I? Was I close? Yeah, thank you. Mr. Tanago is the Executive Director of the Center to End Online Sexual Exploitation of Children. The center partners with governments, companies, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders to expose, neutralize, and deter the online sexual exploitation of children. Thank you, Mr. Tanago. Mr. Frank Russo. Mr. Russo is an Associate General Counsel and Director of the Center for Combating Human Trafficking at the American Conservative Union. The center advocates for policies that address the needs of victims and provide law enforcement with the tools necessary to hold traffickers accountable. Thank you for being here, Mr. Russo. Ms. Ann Basham is the founder and chair of the Interparliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking. The task force is a consortium of members of Parliament and Congress, government leaders, and survivors from more than 25 countries who work to stop human trafficking. We welcome each of you and thank you for appearing today. And now we'll begin by swearing you in. If you would each rise and raise your right hand. Do each of you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have all answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. I want you to know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. There should be a yellow light that appears when there's a minute left, and then when it goes red, we'd ask you to end your testimony at that point. Mr. Pizzuro, you may begin.
Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Sheila Jackson-Lee, and distinguished members of Congress, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Legislation is falling behind the technology that's putting our children at risk. Every day, our inaction to pass legislation results in children being victimized at ever-increasing rates. As someone who's dedicated their life to protecting children, I can assure you we need better awareness, support, policy, and legislation to protect our children. The sad reality is that protecting our children has not been a priority. I'm here to ask you to change that, making protecting our children a priority that they deserve to be. The tech industry has provided limited solutions to protect our children. There has not been a decrease in online victimization. There's been a substantial increase. The tech industry's answer has been to reduce trust and safety teams, employ greater privacy measures, such as end-to-end encryption, and hide behind virtual private networks or VPNs. Everything they do to protect children is voluntary, which includes the information that they share with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and law enforcement. The truth is, they do the bare minimum of what is required. Children are made vulnerable on these platforms as the result of poor moderation, the absence of age or identity verification, and inadequate safety mechanisms. The truth is, we have not protected our children sufficiently due to the ever-increasing use of social media apps and the growth of their online lives. The risk for their harm has increased at such a significant pace that shielding them from abuse and exploitation has become untenable. Today, there are countless victims of CSAM, child trafficking, hands-on offenders, sextortion, and other exploitive crimes that we have yet to even identify. Those who would protect our youth are overburdened and under-resourced, which makes children vulnerable. Our nation's young people are unable to escape from the bombardment of posts, reels, and online social interactions. AI and algorithms push children to those viewers who crave content and are interested in children. These same algorithms push harmful content to children. A major disadvantage of a global society is that any offender can reach any victim anywhere in the world through any app or gaming platform. With AI, offenders can now machine learn and mimic the behavior of children to infiltrate their lives, allowing them to groom children at scale. Criminal organizations have used grooming techniques to sextort children so they might financially benefit. The financial component of profiting off children has increased exponentially. The cyber tip line is a challenging law enforcement not only with respect of quantity of leads, but also the quality of leads. Most of these leads provided by service providers are not actionable. The lack of uniformity is what is reported to service providers results in law enforcement being forced to sort through thousands and thousands of tips in order to find actionable cases. As an example, in the last 90 days, there have been over 99,000 IP addresses throughout the US that have distributed known child sexual abuse images and videos through peer-to-peer networks. Yet 637, less than 1%, are being actually investigated. The darknet has become a haven for child exploitation. Some forums and boards contain the most abusive child exploitation. Videos and images law enforcement has encountered. Chat forums allow offenders to create best practices on how to groom and abuse children. A post named The Art of Seduction has been viewed over 54,000 times on how to groom children. We need the help of our lawmakers. Raven has currently supported and sponsored legislation in the Senate and the House, from the Protect Our Children Act to Stop CSAM, Project Safe Childhood, SHIELD, Report, End Child Exploitation, Earn It, and the Child Online Safety Modernization Act and the Kids Online Safety Act. Alas, some of these bills have passed their respective committees, but yet there has been no vote on the floor. If there was ever a bipartisan call to action that everyone can agree on, it's the protection of all our children. We are at a point that we need to identify what works and provide authorities with sufficient resources to increase their capabilities. One simply can look at the statistics to determine the real story, what is truly happening to our children. Based upon what I experience, I can confidently tell you three things. At the moment, the predators are winning, our children are not safe, and those who are fiercely committed to protect them are drowning and will continue to, so unless we can get the legislation and resources they need to protect our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pizzuro. Chair recognizes Ms. Bautista.
Chairman Biggs, Ms. Dean, on behalf of Ranking Member Jackson Lee and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Vanessa. I am Asian American. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse in the Philippines, and today I am a founding member of the Global Survivor Network, an international group of survivors, and a human rights advocate. I was only 8 years old when the abuse started. It finally stopped when I found the courage to pick up the phone, trembling, my hands shaking, called my best friend at school, and she answered, and through the tears, my hands shaking still, told her, I don't want to be here anymore. I need help. I was put in a shelter home in the Philippines where there were so many children like me. I became a part of a survivor group, healing together and advocating for protection together. Today, I don't speak just for myself, but I speak in behalf of all of my brothers and sisters in our Survivor Network group. Joy is one of my survivor sisters. She was 7 years old. She should have been going to school, playing with friends. Instead, she was taken into a room and abused in front of a camera every day for 10 years. Her abuse was live streamed to pedophiles around the world. Perpetrators log into their cameras, into their computers, and force her to do terrible things in front of a camera. I share this because the threat of child sexual exploitation is very real. And I know as a country, we can be divided along partisan lines, but the one thing we can all agree is that children need to be safe. We are here because we agree that children should not be bought and sold. We are here because the Congress has the power to act. In 2008, Congress came together to pass the PROTECT Act, so children were safe. However, crimes have continued to evolve since then, and our responses also have to evolve. Offenders in the US should not be able to log online in the privacy in their own homes, and with a simple click of their mouse, violate the privacy and dignity of little children as far as like the Philippines. We need to create and enforce strong regulations so that children are protected. And today, as we consider proposed legislations, I want to leave you with three key recommendations. First, survivor representation. I want to encourage us to keep survivor experiences at the forefront. I am pleased that there is a provision requiring survivors to serve on the National Commission on Online Child Sexual Exploitation, and I strongly recommend that this provision be included in the final version of the Earn It Act, and that people with lived experience of this crime be included on this commission. Second is financial restitution. Survivors have been exploited for profit, and so it only makes sense that offenders must be held financially accountable. These offenders have taken years from survivors. They took 10 years from Joy. So she must be compensated, and we must build systems where the money goes straight directly to survivors so they can heal and be restored. Finally, removal of child sexual abuse materials. Remember that the act of abuse is recorded online, and imagine that the most vulnerable, painful memories of your life are just one online search away. How can we expect survivors to carry on with their lives when their privacy is violated every day? That in 2021, Apple promised child safety measures, and 2 years later, our survivor groups, we are still petitioning for them to remove these images of abuse. And all child sexual abuse should not be distributed online, and existing material has to be removed. Please hold tech companies and social media platforms accountable when they fail to keep children safe, and incentivize them to do better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tanago.
Chairman Biggs, Congresswoman Dean, thank you for the invitation to testify at this important hearing. My name is John Tanago, and I serve as Executive Director for International Justice Mission's Center to End Online Sexual Exploitation of Children. IJM is a global non-government organization that protects people in poverty from violence. We are at a crisis point when it comes to child sexual abuse and exploitation online. I spent 7 years living in the Philippines, leading IJM teams to combat the trafficking of children to produce new child sexual exploitation material, especially in live streams. This is the in-person sexual abuse of children by adults in the Philippines, while foreign offenders watch and direct the abuse live online for a fee. This is pay-per-view CSAM, live on demand. Based on IJM's experience supporting over 340 Philippine-led police operations, the abuse usually includes rape, children forced to engage in sex acts with other children, and even children who are harmed in other degrading ways, such as in bestiality. Victims are abused for 2 years on average, with the median age only 11 years old. And IJM has even supported Philippine police in bringing infants to safety. Offenders, including in the US, can pay as little as $33 to watch and direct a child being sexually abused in a live stream. Last week, IGM released findings from our 2-year research study, Scale of Harm, estimating that in 2022, nearly 500,000 Filipino children were sexually abused to create images, videos, and live streams for sale to offenders around the world. That is 1 in 100 Filipino children. Global tech platforms remain fertile ground for this abuse, with Australia's eSafety Commissioner reporting that companies are failing to address child sexual exploitation in live streams or video calls. And the United States is the #1 country of offenders paying for and directing this abuse, with 34% of Philippine cases involving US-based offenders, according to IJM's 2020 study. And in April of this year, the Philippine Anti-Money Laundering Council reported that the highest number of payments for child sexual exploitation flagged by financial institutions in suspicious transaction reports came from the US. Make no mistake, offenders who abuse children online also pose a threat to abuse kids right here. In fact, 58% of respondents reported feeling afraid that viewing CSAM might lead them to commit abuse in person, according to a survey in the Stanford Internet Observatory's Journal of Online Trust and Safety. Laws are urgently needed to prevent child sexual abuse online. Companies must prioritize the safety and privacy of victims by expediting detection, reporting, and removal of CSAM. Early detection and reporting allow law enforcement to bring offenders to justice and victims to safety. IGM prevalence studies across crime types show that replacing offender impunity with accountability can also serve to prevent future harm by deterring offenders. At the same time, the sheer scale of child sexual abuse material necessitates technological prevention. Companies should deploy tools in video chat and messaging apps to disrupt the production of CSAM. Today's phones and apps are not safe by design, precisely because they are built without any technology to prevent child abuse images and video from being taken, streamed, or shared. Without tech safeguards designed to prevent abuse, offenders operate with ease and impunity. Imagine cars without seatbelts, airbags, or anti-lock brakes. Without laws, child exploitation online is a global crisis spiraling out of control. That's why IGM supports the Earn It Act, to change the incentives for tech companies to do everything in their power to prevent child exploitation on their platforms. In closing, some lobby against online safety legislation under the so-called banner of privacy or free speech. But Australia, a well-respected democracy, passed an online safety bill in 2021 requiring tech transparency and safety by design. Free speech and privacy are alive and well in Australia. And if Congress passes online safety legislation to protect kids, the sky won't fall here either. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Alfaro.
Mr. Chairman Biggs and members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to testify before you today. I was born and raised right here in the United States in a small rural town in Texas, and I was kicked out of my home at the age of 16 for being gay. There were no resources for the LGBTQ community within my hometown, and I was terrified of sharing with anyone what I was going through since I had already been rejected by my own family. I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I was on my own and was quickly in the hands of my trafficker. I went online to look for resources. It took my trafficker, Jason Daniel Gandy, less than 2 hours to proposition me online. Jason trafficked me through his massage business where he locked me in a room with adult men who were allowed to rape and abuse me. I believe that I was silenced by society long before I was silenced by my trafficker, but he also added to that silencing by telling me that if I ever shared with anyone what happened to me, then I would go to prison. I stayed silent for 7 years after my escape. Because of the harm that was done to me, I self-medicated, abusing drugs and alcohol as a way to cope. I had several suicide attempts, I dropped out of school, and I was homeless. I needed for one person to recognize that I was not okay, and that I needed support as a homeless and trafficked youth. But no one saw me. Not the homeless program that I was enrolled in, not the school system, not my doctors, and certainly not law enforcement. I was invisible. In 2014, a friend told me that Jason Gandy had been arrested. I was put in contact with the federal prosecutors working on the case. This was the first time I put a name to what happened to me, human trafficking. In 2018, myself and 3 other male survivors testified in the federal trial. Jason Gandy was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no chance of parole, and he was also ordered to pay restitution. I have reflected on the trafficking I experienced as a child, and I have 6 recommendations to share with you today. The US government should strengthen and add resources for the LGBTQ community. Currently, in certain states, LGBTQ resources and education are banned for minors. This will continue to perpetuate trafficking. The lack of resources for LGBTQ youth will cause more vulnerabilities and more trafficking of these young people. We need more resources for homeless youth. I don't think I have to elaborate further on that one. Stop using language that stigmatizes young people. Language matters. The label runaway stigmatizes children. There is just one difference between a missing child and a runaway child: the term. People search for missing children, but runaway children are often stigmatized as bad children. Runaway is a term associated with children who are marginalized and children who are poor. Too often, no one is looking for runaway children. Train law enforcement to identify male victims of trafficking and educate the public that trafficking can happen to males. Improve victims' compensation and restitution. Criminal restitution is mandatory. In my case, the government had forfeited Jason Gandy's assets. The federal treasury kept the money. It took me 2 years and a team of pro bono attorneys to receive the restitution ordered by the court. There is a need for bipartisan legislation to prevent trafficking and hold traffickers accountable, because technology gives predators access to children almost everywhere. And it is critical that we provide safe spaces for all children. In closing, human trafficking is a systemic issue. Marginalized and underserved communities are impacted disproportionately. If we want to help end human trafficking, we have to start with prevention. We need better systems to protect all children. Human trafficking is not a gender-based issue, but a human issue. We have to identify vulnerabilities and intervene to support all children, no matter their gender, their race, or their sexuality. The current politics around the LGBTQ community are hateful and horrifying. After hearing my story today, I hope you can see how certain legislation and hatred can perpetuate human trafficking. Harm to LGBTQ young people creates more vulnerabilities in already vulnerable communities. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Alfaro. Chair recognizes now Ms. Cohen.
Dear Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member.
Is your microphone on? Thank you.
Got it. Dear Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Jackson Lee, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me and my respected colleagues to discuss how we can better protect children.
Ms. Cohen, I don't want to interrupt you, but could you pull the mic just a little bit closer to you, please? Yeah. We all want to hear you.
Thank you.
We know you have an important message.
Should I start over?
Yes, that'd be fine. And let's go ahead and restart the 5. There we go.
Dear Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Jackson Lee, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me and my respected colleagues to discuss how we can better protect children from trafficking and online exploitation. I am Lorie Cohen, the Chief Executive Officer at PACT, Protect All Children from Trafficking, previously known as ECPAT USA. PACT remains a proud member of the global ECPAT network, active in over 100 countries. We are survivor-informed, and I'd like to recognize PACT board member and Survivor Council liaison, Katrina Massey, who has joined us today for this testimony.
Welcome.
PACT is deeply concerned about the welfare of unaccompanied minor children traveling to the United States. Many of them did not wish to leave their homes, but gang violence, war, repressive governments, gender-based persecution, and catastrophic climate events left them with an impossible choice: face death, sexual abuse, or torture if they remain, or risk their lives through a perilous journey to the United States in the hope of securing freedom. COVID-19 exacerbated this migration, and we noticed an increase in migrant arrivals as early as April of 2020. In 2022, PACT published a study with ECPAT Mexico, ECPAT Guatemala, and Yale University that explored the impact of the pandemic on child migration, trafficking, and sexual exploitation. Half the experts indicated that COVID-19 spurred an increase in trafficking. However, 44% lacked the information to answer this question, and 67% could not say whether the migrant children they served were directly affected by sexual exploitation. We called the report undetected because the people and institutions meant to prevent and stop trafficking don't even know how to identify it. Our report also explored the role of technology in youth migration. As with trafficking, half the experts could not tell us whether these children had been affected by online grooming. This figure is alarming, as current research indicates that nearly all CSAM is created abroad. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found that of 32 million reports that its cyber tip line received in 2022, 89.9% resolved to locations outside the United States. Information about trafficking and grooming is lacking on both sides of the border. When visiting shelter facilities for migrant children and their families in Southern California, we learned that trafficking screening was not incorporated into safety protocols. Likewise, limited training of Customs and Border Patrol raises concerns of missed opportunities to identify at-risk children. In fiscal year 2022, CBP processed over 120,000 unaccompanied minors, but reported only a handful of instances of child trafficking to the Office on Trafficking in Persons, as mandated by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Similarly, CSAM content creation abroad has a domestic nexus. Our existing regulatory structure and unchecked demand for pedophilic content have enabled US-based exploiters to access CSAM with ease. The Internet Watch Foundation recently noted that our nation accounts for 30% of the world's CSAM URLs, displacing the Netherlands after that country cracked down on illicit websites. If we want to shut down CSAM, we need legislation that stops it from being hosted on US-based platforms and enforce penalties against US citizens who are fueling the demand for this despicable content. We also need to look ahead to the next development in child exploitation: the use of artificial intelligence to generate sexually explicit imagery of children. Last week, attorneys general from all 50 states wrote Congress asking you to expand existing laws against CSAM that explicitly cover AI-generated materials, a request that we support fully. PACT urges Congress to pass the child protection bills that have been introduced, including the Earn It Act, Project Safe Childhood Act, the No Trafficking in School Zones Act, and Stop CSAM, so that we can prevent human trafficking, online sexual exploitation, and abuse of children, and help survivors access justice. Most importantly, PACT urges the federal government to target demand, which ultimately drives the profit fueling this criminal enterprise. Again, thank you for allowing me and my colleagues to speak on the realities of human trafficking.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. The chair recognizes Mr. Russo for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs and Congresswoman Dean and the distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance on the need to end child exploitation. I'm Frank Russo, CPAC's director of our Center on Combating Human Trafficking, and most importantly, I'm a husband and father who understands the importance of protecting the most vulnerable amongst us. CPAC has long recognized the needs to improve efforts to combat the scourge of human trafficking that has faces communities, as Ms. Dean said, both urban and rural across this country. CPAC was excited to announce the new Center of Combating Human Trafficking at our screening of the film Sound of Freedom earlier this year, and we then partnered with our friends in Mexico to hold an international summit here on Capitol Hill to focus on these very issues. Our new initiative will focus on advancing policies that support victims in their reintegrating into society and removing collateral consequences resulting from their abuse, as you've heard about earlier. We also want to strengthen accountability for traffickers and improve that cross-collaboration between domestic and international entities. As you've heard throughout the day, human trafficking and child exploitation are the fastest growing illicit industries, both in the United States and abroad. The State Department estimates that annually over 17,000 individuals are trafficked into the United States, with Mexico being the largest seller and unfortunately the United States being the largest provider and buyer. We also know that nearly 72% of these trafficking victims are immigrants, meaning that cartels are taking advantage of our lax border policies to enrich themselves in this horrific trade and practice. This trafficking of children often involves multiple layers of abuse, with some victims being used for both sex and labor trafficking across the United States. Coercion is at the heart of these crimes, as transnational gangs such as MS-13 infiltrate communities and take advantage of young men and women who come from broken homes or broken communities. At the same time, the amount of human trafficking convictions across the country are dropping, both here and internationally. To confront what has become a $150 billion criminal enterprise, Congress must work in tandem with, yes, their federal, state, and local partners, but also their international partners to assist in ending this trafficking and these crimes. Meaningful and effective policy to combat human trafficking requires an approach that first identifies the needs of victims while creating swift and effective penalties for criminal traffickers. We know that victims are caught in the horrors of labor, sex, and financial trafficking, often children. We must expose these and replace these misguided policies that provide victims a safe pathway back to society while proportionally punishing their traffickers. For example, Congress has the opportunity to provide pathways to ensure providers or survivors are given mental health and drug treatment services in lieu of harsh criminal penalties. As we've heard earlier, often these children are caught and forced into crimes that then we prosecute those children for. We can't allow that to happen. They need to be given services first and then focus on their reintegration into society. By ensuring we open resources to children who are coerced into these crimes, lawmakers make sure that we do not exacerbate the cycle of abuse for these survivors. Existing legislation, such as the Bipartisan Trafficking Survivors Relief Act and Sarah's Law, provide avenues for these young victims of trafficking to be survivors or to be able to beat their cycle of abuse, and they rescue these survivors and also hold their traffickers accountable. Accountability does not begin or end when the offender traffics within our borders, as we must do more to keep these criminals out of our country and off the very devices our children use on a daily basis. Familiar DNA testing at the U.S.-Mexico border in the prior administration revealed that around 30% of minors were actually related to those they were coming across the border with. Unfortunately, that testing has ended, which allows cartels even greater comfort to recycle these children across the border to move more adults into the country. Most concerningly, our partners at the Department of Homeland Security, HSI, are unable to keep up with these children once that cycle and repetition of abuse ends and they're brought to this country likely to be trafficked either into sex or labor. Criminal traffickers have exploited the explosion of social media and digital platforms amongst children of all ages to manipulate victims and connect with their offenders. The data, as you've heard earlier, bears this out. Our partners at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children identified roughly 16.9 million tips in 2019. That number has ballooned to 29.4 million tips in the last calendar year. Congress must do more to not only hold these offenders accountable, but require technology platforms to take child sexual exploitation seriously. For example, the Earn It Act would address this exponential growth in child sexual abuse material by removing the blanket civil immunity for technology companies that refuse to remove these abhorrent images. Let's be clear, they were refusing under this law to remove those images from their sites. CPAC stands ready to work with our partners in Congress to bring an end to all forms of trafficking. We are grateful that Tim Ballard's story in The Sound of Freedom has reignited a conversation in America on the importance of protecting the most important asset this country has, our next generation. It's now on all of us in this space to deliver real results that will first protect victims, break the cycle of abuse, and of course, hold offenders accountable. Chairman Biggs and Congresswoman Dean, thank you for sending a clear message today. God's children are not for sale.
Thank you, Mr. Russo. And Chair recognizes now Ms. Basham for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs and Representative Dean. It is an honor to testify before you today on child exploitation, both here in the United States and internationally. Today, we have an opportunity to address one of the most important human rights issues, but also one of the most critical global security issues facing our world: the exploitation of children for profit by human traffickers, human smugglers, and advanced criminal networks. Child exploitation and sex trafficking is big business. And unlike any other human rights abuse, it is a transnational organized crime. This is the Subcommittee on Crime, and human trafficking specifically generates $150 billion in profits for traffickers annually, and it is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world. The average age sex trafficking victims are targeted is just 11 to 14 years old. China, Russia, North Korea, the Taliban, and terrorist groups all use child trafficking to fund their operations because, unlike drugs or weapons, a person can be sold over and over again. Child sex trafficking also funds organized criminal networks, including MS-13, one of the most notorious gangs operating in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And these three countries make up 87% of unaccompanied children apprehended at the southern border. A U.S. Treasury investigation found that money generated by local MS-13 cliques engaged in sex trafficking, and this is a quote, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, murder for hire, extortion, and money laundering, and it was consolidated and funneled to the group's central leadership in Central America. The reality is that children are a primary component of this illicit finance network. Many of the Latin American children sent across the border have been taken by organized criminals such as this, and what frequently follows is child sexual exploitation or labor exploitation. From March through May of this year, more than 33,000 unaccompanied children crossed the U.S. border, and the physical and sexual violence, hunger, and thirst that these children often experience traveling to the United States is appalling. Many children and parents who arrive in the United States are from remote regions of Central America, which are often impoverished and isolated, specifically by language barriers. And I think this is something that most people don't recognize. For example, nearly half of those who cross the U.S. border are from Guatemala. And within this one nation, they have 24 different dialects, which means it is difficult to speak with parents regarding the incredible risks that their children face if they send them to the U.S. And because of this, coyotes often trick or coerce mothers into paying children's hefty smuggling fees. And the mothers do so because they believe a better life awaits their children in the United States. And unfortunately, this is often not the case. Because of scenarios like this, many unaccompanied children eventually enter the U.S. foster care system. But we know that the foster care system is already incredibly overburdened, and 60% of child trafficking victims are current or former foster youth. In fact, just a few days ago, it was reported that human trafficking rings have been targeting children in temporary foster care settings, specifically in Texas. And Child Protective Services has paid $30 million to off-duty police officers to watch children who are housed unsupervised in hotels and churches because there is no family for them within the foster care system. Increased burdens on the foster care system put already vulnerable children firmly into the crosshairs of online sexual exploitation and abuse, which has become one of the fastest growing threats against children globally, as we know today. Child trafficking at the southern border is real, And at the same time, in our modern world, human trafficking is a borderless crime, and so is sexual exploitation. The most prevalent form of online sexual abuse is the advertisement of children, actually, through websites and social media. According to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, such advertisements, and this is a quote, such advertisements for sexual services are now central to the human trafficking business model, end quote. And another study concluded that 75% of sex trafficking victims are advertised online. There are many things that we can do, but to stop human trafficking at its core, we must prioritize widespread prevention curriculum here in the United States so that all children can recognize and report their own abuse. The UNODC actually reported that most victims identified in cases, and this is a recent report, were, quote, self-rescued. That means that they had to self-report or escape exploitation on their own. And this is why that's one of the most important fixes that we have. I also encourage you to prioritize many of the bills which have been spoken here today, whether it be the Earn It Act, Report Act, SHIELD Act, and more. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Basham, and thank all of you for your poignant and important testimony. We'll now proceed to member questioning under the 5-minute rule, and I'll begin by recognizing the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record TexasPolicy.com, how porous borders fuel human trafficking in the United States, and also from Heritage, Fighting Human Trafficking and Battling Biden's Open Border.
Without objection.
Ms. Cohen, I think a number of us on the panel took great interest in your description of the screening that doesn't occur at the border. I'd love to give you some time to maybe lend your expertise to the type of screening that we ought to really pursue.
Thank you so much, Congressman Gates. PACT has worked very closely with schools, with shelters, with programs around the country to look at indicators of trafficking and red flags. And we are extremely eager to engage in working with people at the border, with Customs and Border Patrol, and also with shelters. We did find it somewhat concerning that shelters indicated a reluctance to ask questions that might be indicators of trafficking.
And just so I know what category that falls in, these are the shelters that unaccompanied minors go to as they're being processed through HHS?
We were visiting shelters that had children with family members, and some of the testimony we've heard today has indicated that there is a concern of trafficking among those categories as well. And in those shelters, we were informed that there was not any screening done on children specifically for indicators of trafficking because there was a fear of asking questions that might be triggering, that might be problematic for those children. And there are questions that can be asked in a trauma-informed way that could easily assess whether or not the narrative that's being presented is in fact the true narrative, the true situation of the child in question.
Chairman Biggs has led delegations down to the border, and we've seen the chaotic enterprise that exists there. Could you give us a sense of how long an effective screening could take that was trauma-informed and that was effective at determining if there's a way to uproot some of these networks?
I think the questioning can be done fairly quickly if there's certain indicators that might appear immediately that could lead to additional questioning. But I think that it can be rolled out, and we have survivors. Our Survivors Council is very happy, actually, to provide input. We have members of the Survivors Council who were trafficked across the southern border who said that no one asked them anything. And that, for us, is a true source of concern, that there should be more focused questioning and just some basic questions about the family dynamics, the family relationship, and to really assess whether what's being presented, in some cases by the adults speaking on behalf of the child, actually matches up with the child's own testimony.
I'd love to draw on your law enforcement experience. Mr. Pizzuro, when you're able to get that type of real-time data from an effective screening, how can that be useful in disrupting these networks?
The more data that you have, the better the investigation, the better the lead. So it's really important on any information that you can really get. And the challenge is with most investigations is being in the dark. So the more information that law enforcement has to understand where things are going, the more likely we can remedy something.
We have all different layers of law enforcement working on this problem. Where have you seen it be most effective?
The most effective is, just from a trafficking standpoint, is the actual training and the actual, let's say, prioritizing of it. And I think the challenge is it's not really prioritized in law enforcement because we're doing so many different things, and I think we're inundated, so I think that's part of the challenge.
No, it completely is, and Mr. Chairman, I reflect back on when we had Steve Friend before us, who'd been at the FBI, and he had been working some of these cases from a federal level, and when he was reassigned to surveil parents at school board meetings, then no one else picked up those files, and they just they went by the wayside. So I think you're right that prioritization is probably pretty central to.
And the subject matter, honestly, is that from a law enforcement perspective, it's even child sexual abuse material. We don't want to know. So law enforcement generally doesn't really spend that much time doing that. So it's underfunded. There's less resources, and that comes from the agencies itself.
No, thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it Pizzuro?
Yes, sir.
Good. Thank you. What branch of law enforcement does the most work on these cases? Is it the FBI or is it local law enforcement? Who is the most active?
The Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which is comprised of 61 task forces throughout the U.S., does the bulk of all the child sexual abuse cases in the U.S.
How do they do? I'm not sure how a 61-member group does that.
So the Protect Our Children Act in 2008 authorized the task force, and it created 61 task forces throughout the U.S. The challenge is that they're really underfunded and under-resourced. So, for example, from New Jersey, where I was from, the New Jersey State Police, we were in charge of that entire task force for that state. So what we would do is the task force probably has about 5,000 affiliated agencies. So most of the cyber tips that are sent go to those local law enforcement then to investigate.
And then those cases are prosecuted mostly in state court or federal court?
State court. You'll have different jurisdictions. For example, sometimes you'll get a federal prosecution, but the majority of them are handled in state court.
Does the FBI get involved at all in interstate operations?
They will do operations, but generally speaking is that some will be interstate, some they'll do some larger investigations as well, but for the most part, the ICAC task force, along with HSI, are really the two predominant agencies that do most of the child exploitation.
They're mostly state agencies?
Yes.
All right. Anybody else up here from law enforcement? No, I didn't think so. Mr. Russo, you were here. What years were you here with Goodlatte?
So I was here with Congressman Goodlatte back in 2016 and 2017, sir.
Do you remember anything DeSantis did when he was on this committee?
No, sir, I cannot speak to that. It's quite lost in my mind. But I'm glad you asked the question.
I have the same problem.
Sir, I think it's really important. I'd represented prosecutors prior to this as well, as I think you know. And one of the pieces I mentioned was that prosecutions are down domestically and internationally. One of the problems we have that you speak to directly is getting survivor input and support in that space is extremely difficult to do because we don't do enough for those survivors to then assist in those investigations. So we're asking so much of them, but we're providing so little in return.
Now, you're looking at legislation, are you not, that could be helpful here? Is there any particular law that is before us that you recommend that we take up and sponsor or support?
Thank you, Congressman. I think there's a couple that come to mind. First, as I mentioned, was the Trafficking Survivor Relief Act, as well as Sarah's Law. Both of those are focused on providing those, not just children, but also adults who have faced criminal offenses as a part of their trafficking. Often they're coerced into the crimes you would expect, things like prostitution, but they're also coerced into other crimes that you may not expect, such as drug distribution or forced to commit robberies or assaults. Well, those things hang over those individuals as we then need them to prosecute the actual criminal offender. Well, if you have a criminal record hanging over your head, how likely are you to comply with law enforcement, knowing that you may not be able to yourself come out of trouble? I think that's presented a significant problem. And then the only other one I'll mention is the Earn It Act, which I think will help focus on actually holding tech platforms accountable so that they are doing a better job, and Mr. Pizzuro can speak better to this, but they are often non-responsive to law enforcement, and that's a significant problem as well.
I know my staff can do this for me, but who are the prime sponsors of those bills in the House?
On Sarah's Law, Congressman Westerman from Arkansas, and then on TSRA, we're working through that process, but we know that Senator Gillibrand in the Senate has been a big champion of that as well.
Right. There was some legislation that I was involved in sometime in the past to get more monies for nurses to be aware of the signs of trafficking. Is that still providing funding for nurses to be trained in finding those signs?
It is, but I will say a couple things. One is that there's, like anything, there's a need for more funding and resources in that space specifically. Forensic nurses, like every profession right now, especially in the medical industry, are strapped for both time and talent. And so getting actually nurses into that profession and having them trained appropriately takes both a larger financial investment, but also a focus on pushing the medical profession in that direction, which is a difficult challenge. So yes, the law has been very successful, but it needs, like anything, more resources and more attention.
Thank you, Mr. Russo. It's nice to see a good live person back.
Thank you, sir.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Pizzuro, a couple of questions, and I understand from your testimony that you have extensive experience in investigating crimes against children. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. From a law enforcement's perspective, what can Congress do to help alleviate the red tape and allow officers to go out and get these criminals?
Well, one of the biggest solutions is actually uniformity in the actual tips that are being sent to law enforcement. For example, is that different companies send different points of data. So maybe Snapchat might only give me, for example, a screen name. Dropbox might give me a couple other points of data. The challenge is that some of the companies either report nothing or then they report everything. So the challenge is law enforcement has to go and filter all through those tips, and we're not getting to the most egregious cases. So the more information that we have and the more data that we have from those companies to help identify that would be a solution.
Gotcha. I also understand there are more juvenile offenders now victimizing other juveniles. How did this come to be, and what's going on there?
Well, it's a disturbing trend. If you talk to a lot of different task forces throughout the U.S., they are now coming in contact with a lot more juveniles. And the challenge is because everyone's online. So you will now have 16-year-olds looking at 8-year-olds. So the challenge is that all that content, when we were talking about the AI algorithms, everything is pushed that way. So now what's happening is you're going to have that content as a child and it's pushed there. So no different than we look at something and then all of a sudden we're getting those same videos. So that content, those algorithms are pushed, and now we're getting more child offenders than ever before. And you're talking 16 and 17-year-olds as opposed to any time.
Gotcha, thank you. Mr. Russo, I've been down to the border with Mr. Biggs a couple of times, and one of the things that we found out, and I mentioned this in testimony or in hearing here before in questioning, is that the prices on people's head now to come across the U.S. southern border. And, you know, just south of the border, it's $4,000 to $5,000, and further south in the Triangle Nations, $7,000 to $8,000. I think Syrians were paying $20,000 across the U.S. border. But my understanding is that the cartel is actually getting the money. And in some situations, my understanding, the administration, this policies on the border is it's created basically two things. They're either muling the drugs across to pay that passage, whether it's $4,000, $7,000, or $8,000. They can backpack heroin, cocaine, or fentanyl across the border to pay that passage. But the other thing is they can become indentured servants and slaves. Are you seeing that at the child trafficking? Are they making installment payments through child trafficking back to the cartel?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question.
Sure.
The answer is absolutely, and I think something we haven't talked as much about is labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is a significant portion of this, so when they put that indentured servitude piece on someone's head, I'll give you an example. In Oklahoma, we know that as they've had legal marijuana dispensaries pop up, some of the illegal grows around them have been produced and basically staffed by those individuals who have come across the border and owe debt. So law enforcement are coming across Chinese nationals, Mexican nationals, Honduran nationals, you choose, where, with obviously dialect challenges, who are then been put in a state that they're unfamiliar with, oftentimes away from family or other known contacts. And in that process, they owe that debt to pay through that labor trafficking for an undetermined amount of time.
Another thing I found really interesting is these sponsors that's supposed to be taking these children. And we have sponsors that sign up for maybe 30 children, and they never see the children. But we're trying to figure out now on our end legislatively, how do we put teeth into that? So that if you sponsor those children, you don't know those children, you never see those children, but somehow or another you were their sponsor to get them in this country unaccompanied, then we're going to try to put teeth in that law as well. And hopefully we can get support from your groups and organizations for that as well. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes now the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking the survivors and the advocates for the survivors for your testimony today. And this is a wide-ranging hearing covering numerous topics, and I'd like to focus on a couple of points. Number one, the ranking member of the committee, Sheila Jackson Lee, is absent today because she has the flu, and but I did want to let you all know that had she been here, she would have talked about her bill, H.R. 30, which strengthens the legal framework that exists to ensure children and youth are protected and that perpetrators and facilitators of any manner of child exploitation are exposed and face severe consequences. And she introduced that bill, H.R. 30, the Stop Human Trafficking in School Zones Act, along with Republican Representative Mike McCall, to ensure that schools will be safe havens for our children. And she pointed out that a 2018 survey reports that 55% of young sex trafficking survivors in Texas were trafficked while at school or school activities, and that 60% of trafficked adults said they were first groomed or solicited for trafficking on school campuses. But I also want to point out that data from 2017 shows that 53% of arrests for so-called child prostitution, in quote, were of black children. 53% of arrests for child prostitution were of black children. This data reflects the reality that black children who are survivors of sex trafficking are more likely than their white counterparts to be surveilled and arrested by law enforcement for prostitution-related offenses. Ms. Cohen, equity and inclusion are bad words today, but what can be done to advance racial equity for survivors and victims of child sex trafficking?
Thank you, Congressman, for this question. And I do actually want to thank you for bringing attention to the issue of child sex trafficking in the United States among domestically trafficked youth. Our research had specifically been on this question of looking at screening along the border, but PACT is well aware that the majority of child sex trafficking actually occurs in the United States with U.S. citizen children. And it's important because I believe that Ranking Member Jackson Lee's research that's cited there is looking at primarily U.S. citizen children. It is absolutely essential that we bring equity, inclusion, and an awareness of the existing vulnerabilities for Black and brown children, and specifically Black and brown girls, who are disproportionately arrested and criminalized. As we discussed, and Mr. Russo mentioned, Sarah's law attempts to address some of that issue at the point of conviction, but PACT has been advocating very strongly against the arrest of these children in the first place. And what we really need to be doing is when we're looking at this transaction of someone purchasing of a child, who is the buyer? Why are we not arresting the buyers when buyers actually classify, if an adult is purchasing a child, that adult is a trafficker under the existing language of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act.
Okay, and let me stop you right there and ask you another question. You've heard the majority sing the praises of the movie Sound of Freedom. In your experience, are the events depicted in that movie representative of how trafficking typically occurs in the United States, yes or no?
No, that is not the case.
All right, and Mr. Alfaro, you have publicly spoken about the Sound of Freedom and its failure to depict the most common forms of child trafficking. Can you please tell us how your critique of the film was received by the movie's fans, and what have you had to endure as a result of you pointing out the truths about that film?
Thanks for your question. Anytime I speak publicly, there's always fear of backlash. One, because I am gay, Latino, and male. And anytime I come forward with any story or experience of my own publicly, there's always, every single time, backlash saying that I deserved what happened to me, that what happened to me was my own fault. But when I spoke out about The Sound of Freedom, and I will say, I don't think that all movies that are not true stories are necessarily bad. But I think that when we are at a time where there's a lack of education and awareness around what human trafficking looks like, I think a lot of people get this idea of what is depicted in a film like The Sound of Freedom. And a lot of the messages that I got and responses that I got were that because I did not agree with what was depicted in the film, that I was a pedophile or a trafficker myself because I didn't agree with it. And that is extremely harmful. When you have people with lived experience who are sharing what has happened to them and what is truly happening right here within the United States, and people aren't willing to listen, and instead are listening to a film that is heavily publicized, it creates a lot of harm.
Hate to interrupt.
I appreciate the gentleman's indulgence, and Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record the statement of Sheila Jackson Lee.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pizzuro, as child sex abuse material has become more prevalent, we are now being faced with the proliferation of artificial intelligence and the ability to generate images that are indistinguishable as false or real. Do you think this will become an issue as it relates to child sex abuse material? And do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, so when you're talking specifically about AI, now with generative AI, I can do two things. One, I can actually now basically mimic a child in order to groom people. And then secondly, now with AI, I can technically create my own victim in my household. So we're a year away from being able to take a victim, and a lot of child sexual abuse happens in that household. So now I can create an exact victim of or replica of my child the way AI is going. So we need to have some sort of regulation for that, or how we're going to implement restrictions in how it's used. As an example, ChatGPT, if I went in there and I searched, how do I exploit a child, it doesn't give me an answer. But if I say I'm doing a research project on how children are exploited, it'll give me that information. So technology is getting so quick. Those are the things that we have to think about in some sort of way in order to protect children.
Do you think social media companies should be held accountable for putting this information forward?
Yes, I mean, they're pushing the content. So as I was told by one member of one of the tech companies, is that we can't have a conversation with you because you said there has to be accountability. there has to be accountability. I mean, everyone is on their platform, and what we're doing is we're pushing that data to them over and over.
My understanding is that Instagram is one of the biggest proliferators of pornography out there. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say Instagram is, because there's so many different other platforms, but what Instagram does do and Meta does, especially referencing that article, is they do push that algorithms, and you're getting a lot of people. Tomorrow, if I'm 10 and I get on Instagram, well, guess what? Now, once I'm on there, I'm also pushed content of other men.
Mr. Chairman, as we've heard in committee before, the social media companies, including a vice president for Facebook, acknowledged that they enable illegal immigration, they foster human trafficking, and I think they should be held accountable. I think there has to be some accountability brought to the social media companies. The protections they've had under Section 230 have become abuse at this point, and I think there's really something we need to do about it. Mrs. Basham, are you familiar with the state of Florida versus United States case presided by Judge Wetherell?
Can you remind me of that?
In that case, the judge ruled that President Biden's catch and release policy is unlawful and gave the administration 7 days to comply with the federal immigration law. From your experience in dealing with human trafficking, do you believe that what is happening at our southwest border is making the environment ripe for increased human trafficking?
Well, what I can tell you is this, is that there does need to be a solution right now, that when we see 33 children crossing the U.S. border unaccompanied within a 3-month period, that something is wrong. And these children are largely unprotected once they get into other settings within here, so that's what I can tell you.
Mr. Alfaro, appreciate your comments earlier. Welcome to the world of politics with people slamming you or whatever. Join the crowd. In regards to sound of freedom, isn't it good, though, that there's an awareness being brought to child exploitation, human trafficking?
It is good when it is accurate.
But don't movies take license frequently? I mean, I see movies and I go, that's not deep. I've read the book, I've read a few books or whatever. That's not depicting it accurately. And they're not true to the story, but they're delivering a message.
They're definitely delivering a message, and like I mentioned, I don't think all, stories that are not based on a true story are bad. There were parts of The Sound of Freedom that I didn't fully agree with, and this superhero idea that people need someone to come and save them out of their situation is actually very unlikely. No one came in and saved me out of my situation, and the majority of my survivor colleagues have the same feelings, that no one has ever stepped in and
So as someone that consumes a little bit of Hollywood, I mean, isn't that Mel Gibson in a few movies? Isn't that the beautiful actress that is headlines a movie or whatever? I mean, isn't that the same thing that we do? We caricature with, and isn't this a caricature also? I yield back, sir.
Okay, thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to start by thanking all of you for your testimony. Mr. Alfaro and Ms. Bautista, if I could start with both of you. Thank you for your honest account. And I know it's a very truncated account of what you have gone through. Very different stories. I guess I'll start with you, Mr. Alfaro. How are you?
That's kind of hard to answer right now, but I'm okay.
Okay. Ms. Bautista.
I am okay too, but I just want to express how I am looking forward of how the Congress would act and how the Congress would move forward into proposed legislations today, because I know it is very important. And even as we speak today, there are children that are being exploited. So I am emotional because it's my friends in the Philippines, it's younger children, and I myself doesn't have a kid right now, but in the future, I don't want to see another kid being exploited. I don't want to see another survivor like me going here to say like, hey, we need to do something. Congress has to do something. A lot of people around here are here to, to have that, to come forward and say we have to do something and we have to do it right now. So thank you.
I appreciate that, and I think I speak for myself. I don't speak for anybody else. We want to come up with solutions. We want to come up with answers. On the prevention and protection side, and I guess also on the healing side, can you tell me, each of you, briefly, what has been the most effective parts of healing? How can we learn as a society how to lift up those who are survivors and help them heal?
Thank you for redirecting the conversation to important prevention and the post work for survivors. For me, it was a really long and tough journey living in silence, as I mentioned earlier. No one really understood. I didn't even understand what human trafficking was, and I didn't know that what happened to me was human trafficking, right? So if you don't really know what happened to you, how do you identify the tools and resources that you need to heal from the trauma that you've experienced? And that's why there is such a huge need for accurate awareness out there to really help survivors or those who are vulnerable to the crime to understand what human trafficking is, and if it has happened to them, that they know where to go and what resources that they need to get to a place to where I now am. And so
I appreciate that, and I agree with you. I don't think Hollywood or anybody else ought to take creative license with the facts. It's one thing in fiction, but not with the facts. Ms. Bautista, for your own healing, and I was thinking about your friend Joy. How is Joy? I hope she's on the path to healing.
She is, yeah, she is. She is thriving. She is a social worker now in the Philippines. So one of the things that really help us for survivors like me in our healing journey, in our restoration journey, is to provide more resources on education and on awareness of the crime, and also financial assistance, because all of us came from a really hard life of poverty. So a lot of us really needs to move on, and through financing or through educational assistance that help us, because in reality, a lot of survivors, or culturally, education is the primary source of hope, source of moving on to our healing, to what bad thing happened to us. Awesome. And that's our, in achieving to those dreams and hopes would really help survivors. So
Very well said. I appreciate that. And forgive me for moving just because I want to get something in about tech. It seems to me there ought to be legislation that could force the big tech companies to block and fail to distribute the images we're talking about. What is that solution?
Well, if you look at Apple, Apple had that device-based scanning that they rolled back into 2021, and I think that's part of the challenge with end-to-end encryption and a lot of the other tech proposals. Nothing's being scanned. So with nothing being scanned, we don't have any way to look at it. So even if you can use AI or other programs in order to do that and solutions, again, and hopefully to identify victims. My challenge is, like Ms. Bautista, is there are hundreds of thousands of victims that law enforcement can't get to and identify and get them the help they need.
I thank the chairman for his indulgence, and I thank the ranking member for asking me to sit in on her behalf, and I fully support all the legislative work she's doing in that area. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses today for helping us gain a fuller understanding of this absolute horror that is going on and victimizing far too many people, and particularly young people. Listening to the testimony, it seems to me there are a few facets of the approach we can take to addressing this problem. And that starts with just increased public awareness, that all of us have a responsibility and a role we can play working with nonprofits, working with law enforcement, working with other stakeholders in our community in order to help people not become victims, and also to raise awareness about the political dimensions of the problem. In my state of California, for example, for many years, we've tried in the legislature to get the legislature to take this issue more seriously by classifying human trafficking as a serious felony. Unfortunately, every year, the Public Safety Committee has stopped it from passing, and they did that this year as well, a bill to make trafficking of a minor a serious felony. But after a public outcry, they ended up doing something I think unprecedented in recent history, as the committee reversed itself, and just a couple days ago that bill passed the state assembly unanimously and is now going to the governor's desk. So I think that is a testament to the power of public awareness. But beyond that, there seem to be three main facets of the solutions that we need to be working on with great urgency and doing everything we can. The first being holding those who peddle this material and those who traffic young people accountable. The second being the social media element, and the third being what's going on at the border. So on the first, Mr. Russo, you've mentioned in your testimony that we need to have stricter penalties for the abusers. What do you think would be the specific changes that would be most important?
It's a great question, and I'll note one in California. It's great that they've moved that legislation forward. The idea of being supportive of victims is not incompatible with the idea of being harder on traffickers, and we need to be balancing that appropriately. One approach that our organization is focused on is looking at things such that already exist in the law, like gang enhancements, and applying them for human traffickers who coerce minors into other criminal behavior. Oftentimes, you can't make that straight gang connection, so that enhancement may not be available. But if you're an individual who forces a 16-year-old into prostitution or a 15-year-old into trafficking fentanyl or other drugs, that penalty increase, that gang enhancement that exists in the law, should be eligible for you regardless of whether you're in a criminal organization or not. So that's something I would ask that the committee consider, is that focusing on actually enhancing for folks who are using that coercive element. Let's make the game harder for the traffickers that they're already playing.
Thank you. That's a great insight. And Ms. Basham, when it comes to the immigration facet, you testified that from March through May of this year, more than 33,000 unaccompanied children crossed the U.S. border. The physical and sexual violence, human degradation, hunger, and thirst that these children often experience en route to the United States is appalling. Sadly, you go on, this is just a prelude to the violence that many experience once they're in the U.S. So why do you think it is that we have had this huge increase in the number of unaccompanied minors, and how do we stop it from happening? What are the steps that we should be taking right now?
Well, there are several things I think that I'm not going to dive into specific border policy on what we can do now, but I will say that there are several things for deterrence purposes. First of all, in Guatemala, that was the country that I brought up early on. I actually went there last year, spoke there. The Secretary of Sexual Trafficking is on my task force. And one of the things that they're doing, she said, we want this to stop. They have 47% of unaccompanied minors are coming from Guatemala. And the problem is, she said, that a lot of these mothers are handing over their children to smugglers because they do not know. And so what they've actually done there is they've developed mobile units. And so I think that one thing that I would suggest, and this is a little bit out of sort of the scope of some of this, is a CODEL. I actually think it would be really, really helpful to do a CODEL down to Guatemala to actually see some of this and talk to some of these people in person, because I do think if there was increased funding or things like that for them to get mobile education units into these places, that it would actually be extremely helpful to some of these children from a prevention standpoint alone. That's one country in Guatemala. Outside of that, and then again, that gets to an awareness campaign, which is really central to a lot of this. Outside of that, I really think it comes down to also the communication between children here and their parents back there. That's one of the things that wasn't really discussed much today, but there needs to be a really clear, good communication loop so that children who are unaccompanied here can communicate back with their parents there, because if more parents knew of the dangers that their kids would face, they would not send them.
Thank you very much. And with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, if I could just quickly ask Mr. Pizzuro, of the laws that you listed for holding social media companies accountable, what do you think is the most important change to make them more proactive in making sure that this material isn't disseminated on their platforms?
Time has expired, but you may answer.
Okay, they need to be mandated, and they definitely, from a standpoint of just if we can just get them to standardize what they give and be a little bit more proactive. You know, we're looking for incremental changes. There's a lot of changes that need to be done, but that's where we need to at least start.
Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today, for sharing your stories, your expertise, and your insight about this important issue. I spent a large part of my professional career working on ending the sexual exploitation of children, domestic violence, and human trafficking. And it's very important to me that as Congress, we are doing everything we can to bring awareness to this issue, to incarcerate perpetrators, and to support survivors. So each of you has brought important perspective to us today about how we might do those things, and we appreciate that very much. This session, I have introduced the National Trafficking Hotline Enhancement Act and also the Report Act in the House, which would modernize and strengthen existing reporting procedures to disclose crimes involving child sex abuse to NCMEC and ensure we're giving law enforcement the tools that they need to help identify this type of behavior and intercept and bring it to a stop. I'm very proud that in both cases, those bills have bipartisan support in this committee and want to particularly acknowledge Ranking Member Dean for co-sponsoring the Report Act. I believe it is a very important part of legislation that I hope to see us bring to the full House. Now, with that, Ms. Basham, I'd like to return to your testimony and talk in some more depth about the concepts of how minors are enticed and groomed on the internet and how abusers target and exploit them. One of the things that the Report Act aims to do is to require electronic communication service providers to report incidents of enticement of minors on a line. Can you explain how this happens and how that type of requirement would help stop human trafficking?
Yeah, so the Report Act, first of all, is very important. So I'm really grateful that you have sponsored that. So enticement can happen in a variety of ways. First of all, the reason they target children, and that's something I need to state up front, is because they are especially vulnerable. Their children are by nature more trusting, in all of that. With the Report Act and just in general with children being groomed online, one of the ways it is it's someone who usually is, they develop a trusting relationship online, and through that process they learn, that's why we call it grooming. It's not kidnapping, it's a form of really luring the child in to do things, and then it dives into actual coercion. So we have children who have been threatened, or their families have been threatened, and then through that they are lured to do things, or other things have happened to them through that.
And a study by RAIN found that law enforcement, and I think Mr. Pizzuro also touched on this issue, is overburdened at times by the number of leads that they have, the sheer volume of cases and tips that they're trying to investigate. And another provision of the Report Act would increase the retention period for this type of information and tip line reports to allow law enforcement more time to go back and investigate these cases. Could you explain how this measure and other tools might help law enforcement manage the growing number of tips and cases that they are investigating? Ms. Basham. We'll start with you, and then we'll hear from Mr. Pizzuro.
Okay. So I think one of the main things with all of this is So, sorry, can you state that again? I thought that you were stating it for him over there. Sorry.
Yes, my question was about retention of information. So one of the other provisions would require these companies to retain, when they have information that looks like it may be exploitative or is a tip for law enforcement, they would keep it for longer to help law enforcement deal with the volume of potential cases that are coming in. And the question was, how might that be helpful, and any other tools you can think of that we could be providing that would make the investigation of these cases something that is easier to tackle?
Well, absolutely. First of all, the number one thing is that law enforcement needs every bit of help that they can get. So that's the number one thing. They are understaffed, and we know that there is an increased burden. So that's first of all. The second thing is just simply it takes some of the burden off with some of the training. Like, law enforcement has to be trained to recognize and report this, and so it's obviously called the Report Act. So I think it alleviates some of that key burden that really needs to come off of law enforcement.
Mr. Pizzuro, what would you add in response to that question?
So 90 days was the standard going to 1 year, and that's the standard for probable cause. So the challenge is that we can't get to the victims and identify them because most likely, most of the times we're getting a case after 6 months. So the ability to actually find and locate that victim, identify that victim is really important from that retention standpoint. And one of the other things I'll add is that we need companies to actually be responsive to legal process immediately and send us that data, and we have difficulties with a lot of those companies now as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful insight. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I was a former member of the South Carolina General Assembly just last year. And a few years ago, I worked with Shared Hope International and our Attorney General, Alan Wilson, to craft a human trafficking bill. And to Mr. Russo's point earlier about how you have to balance both the prosecution side while also being compassionate and taking care of victims, particularly minors, that was really the crux of the legislation that we did. We were considered that year to be the most improved state in the country in addressing human trafficking, but we've got a long way to go. Our Attorney General is doing a fantastic job. He actually recently spearheaded a letter with over 50, it was actually 54 attorneys general from all the states and territories about the threat of how artificial intelligence is being used to exploit children. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record Attorney General Wilson's letter and the letter from all the attorneys general.
Without objection.
Sadly, our children are constantly exploited through child sexual abuse material daily in our country. The U.S. is now the host. It's not a proud moment, but we host more child sexual abuse material than any other country in the world. Mr. Chairman, I'd also like unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from our friend Congresswoman Ann Wagner, who's doing an incredible job on this space too, trying to update some of our laws.
Without objection.
Look, online platforms, by design maybe, are created, and kids spend an inordinate amount of time, 7 to 8 hours a day online. They get addicted to these apps. They're on their phones constantly. I think the mission here is to protect our kids from things that they see, things that happen online, the grooming that takes place. Earlier this year, I introduced the Targeting Child Predators Act to help in this effort. Would it surprise this body to know that if you are an internet service provider and you receive a subpoena, that you actually let the individual know that you're trying to subpoena, that law enforcement's looking at them? So we're trying to put a stop to that. This is just one avenue, I think, that we've talked about that would have a meaningful effect on this. Ms. Basham, South Carolina, and I'm just going to use my state as an example, but this is really everywhere. We have in my district specifically, it's very rural, but it's also a heavily tourist economy. We have the beach. What kinds of trends in child exploitation do you generally find in tourist areas?
Well, tourist areas specifically are always hotspots, but I will say this, I actually think sexual exploitation, this is one of the unique things, it happens everywhere. And so it really is a borderless crime. Tourist hotspots obviously leave children more vulnerable because people are there to vacation, they tend to be intoxicated, and so that actually can increase some of it too.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit more about how vulnerable populations, such as foster youth or unaccompanied minors, are more susceptible to being victims of these crimes?
Well, I think there are a number of populations that are really susceptible because of any vulnerabilities. And so when you are detached from your family and you are an unaccompanied minor, you're vulnerable to several different things. And one of those would be someone who poses as a family member, a trusted friend, an adult, that leaves you vulnerable to actually participating in a gang or actually being trafficked yourself and exploited yourself.
Thank you. Mr. Pizzuro, I want to turn to you real quick. Last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children Cyber Tip Line received 32 million reports of suspected child exploitation online. In your experience, I think you testified, social media companies are not properly censoring that material or regulating that material, are they?
No, and if you go further, and that's where the Apple, out of the 32 million tips, Apple had 175 last year. So what does Apple have? 58% of the market share in the U.S. for iPhones. So I think that's, and it's not just calling out Apple, it's just it's the industry as a whole.
Well, I think you're actually heading exactly where I wanted to go here, because to me, when I'm looking at Facebooks and Googles and Instagrams, the gulf between maybe the top reporter and the bottom is just so wide. Facebook had 21 million, but Apple had 234. Can you touch on that contrast? How, it's kind of crazy to me. I mean, social media companies will censor our own speech, but they won't get this stuff off their platforms. So talk about the privacy concerns, I guess, from what are they talking about? What are they alleging from a privacy perspective as to why they will not fight back against child sexual abuse material on their platforms?
Well, they moved that they can't see it on their platform. So if you go to end-to-end encryption, where you have basically both sides where that data is there, they're saying that we can't see it. So again, they're not even scanning for that. So the challenge becomes is that they're totally dark. So the idea is that if I don't know what's happening on my platform, then technically I don't have to report it. So what happens is then other companies do the direct opposite. If it's something, then I'm going to report it. So that is really the disparity between Meta and Apple as an example.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield.
Thank you. Now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'll tell you, I have questions for each one of you. I'm going to probably limit myself to one, and I urge you to be as succinct as possible, yet say what you think is pertinent to it. So I'll start with you, Mr. Alfaro, because one thing you said that really caught my attention is that the restitution that you were awarded wasn't awarded to you, it went to the federal government, and you actually had to litigate to get restitution back as a victim. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, sort of. It was a process. It was a gruesome process, and I hate that anyone has to go through a process after testifying in a criminal or federal trial, and has to explain why they are deserving of the money owed to them. But basically, I went about a year questioning, when will I be receiving the restitution? More time went on. I was told I would be receiving it by Christmas time, and then another year went by, and then they said I would receive it by Christmas time, and then things just kept changing. And so I had to seek out legal counsel just to help me figure out where this money was, and eventually after that, shortly after that, I did receive legal counsel, and I had to contact the other survivors and help them with legal counsel as we went through a second process called the remission process, where they were supposed to be contacted and not one of them were contacted. So I contacted them again, asked them if they had been contacted. They said no, so I connected them with pro bono attorneys as well.
Thank you for explaining that, and that's something I think Congress should look into as well. Ms. Bautista, you mentioned something which I am aware of, is the difficulty of getting images removed even after the tech companies are aware that basically their criminal images have been viralized. So can you talk about that for a second? How did you implied that you got some of those removed. How did you get that done?
Thanks for that question. The petition, it was currently being petitioned against Apple, well, not against Apple, but asking Apple to remove the child sexual abuse materials online. My fellow survivors of OSIC has been living and hoping to move forward from this abuse, from this horrific situation they were at, but being into that situation where they have these materials still online and they can't move forward. So that's why I am asking, alongside with survivors of OSIC, is to have these removed permanently, because it keeps going back into our lives. It keeps going back into OSIC survivors' lives. And how can we move forward? How can we move forward for our lives if we still keep being reminded of all of these horrific situations?
Appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that, and I agree with you. And again, Congress needs to act. Mr. Tanego, I'm reminded as we're listening to this of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which a lot of these platforms hide behind and shelter. Do you have any opinion or you want to comment on that?
Well, I think there's two things I would say to that. Thank you for that question. First, I would say that Section 230 does not protect electronic service providers from their own design decisions. So when they design an app or a platform in such a way that actually encourages or facilitates child sexual abuse and exploitation, then they have no Section 230 protection. But I do think that it's important that the Earn It Act and other legislation address this gap, because the reality is every industry is governed by regulations, and every industry has industry-wide standards. And if they don't meet those standards, then they can be held to account. And it's up to judges, it's up to courts to decide if a company has failed to meet its duty of care or its obligations. But right now, there are no obligations, there are no requirements on the tech sector to build their platforms safe by design, to detect and remove child sexual abuse material. And so what we see is incredibly uneven responses from the tech sector. I think the reality is it's not just about any one company, but it's an industry-wide problem, and that's why you need something like the Earn It Act that can really transform the entire industry's response.
Thank you. I'm going to go real quick to Mr. Pizzuro. Fusion centers. Are you familiar with fusion centers, and how are they working on this problem?
Yes, right now, well, I could speak to New Jersey. New Jersey's fusion centers aren't working on the ICAC problem or the social media problem. So that's something, again, you know, additional resources, maybe they can start looking into that for more prioritization.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. We are out of time, and this is an incredibly important subject, and we have all learned a lot. And Congress must act, and I would anticipate that some pieces of legislation, we know that some of them have passed out of the committee in the Senate, but we don't have them across the mall yet. And then there are some that we have that I know that we're going to be taking up soon as well. So thank you to the audience, thank you to the witnesses, and thank you to Ms. Dean and my colleagues both sides of the aisle for being here today. With that, we are adjourned.